So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michele Burman, and I work in the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research at the University of Glasgow. And I'm really delighted to introduce to you Dr. Delanie Woodlock, who is going to be presenting today's workshop on minimising vicarious traumatisation in the conduct of research on domestic violence and sexual assault. Delanie has worked in the area of domestic violence and sexual assault for over 15 years, providing support, referrals to victim survivors, as well as conducting research on domestic violence and child sexual abuse. She is based at the University of New South Wales in Australia, where she's currently working on a project on the impact of child sexual abuse material offending on the family context, and in particular, the impact of that offending on partners and ex-partners in that family context. Currently, Delanie is a visiting scholar at SCCJR in Glasgow, and I'm delighted to introduce you to her to talk about her work and her research in this area. We've had, this has been a really unprecedented number or amount of interest in this workshop. We had to cap the numbers because they were just getting too large. So I would ask you, and Delanie would pick this up, to think about your motivations of why you wanted to come along to today's workshop, because I think that will make for some interesting discussion later on. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Delanie. If you have any comments, please put them in the chat and I'll try and monitor them, or raise your hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. I will just share my screen now. Let's see if we can do that. Okay, can you see that okay? Oh.
Yes.
Great. So thank you everyone for coming today. So as Michele said, I'm going to be talking about the ways in which we can minimise vicarious trauma when we're researching sexual assault and domestic abuse. So as we begin, I want to give a disclaimer. So in the trauma field, there's a lot of theories that are seen as truths and science and as facts. And because the brain and neuroscience have become involved in the trauma field, there's an impression that we might know for sure what trauma is and how it works and what the impacts are. But the truth is that we don't really know that much about the trauma field. And while there's significant evidence around certain theories, these could all be unproven tomorrow with a future discovery. So what I will be discussing today are theories and opinions, and I hope you'll keep that in mind throughout the workshop. So here's what I aim to cover today. So I will do an introduction to myself. Then we'll look at what trauma is, the impact of working in domestic abuse and sexual violence, the impact of researching domestic abuse and sexual violence. We'll look at vicarious trauma, how and why it develops, and then how you can minimise the risks of vicarious trauma. And then importantly, we'll also look at self-care. So as Michele said, my name is Delanie Woodlock. I'm a researcher at the University of New South Wales. My work in this area started while I was working as an advocate for victim survivors of domestic abuse about 15 years ago. While I was working in the sector, I was also writing my PhD. I was looking at the impact of abuse and trauma on young women's mental health. And after I got my PhD, I've sort of worked in both community sector and academia. And this research has included violence against women with disabilities, technology facilitated abuse, and most recently I've been doing work on child sexual abuse and particularly online child sexual exploitation. I also co-manage a service in Australia that provides support to advocates and researchers around vicarious trauma. As Michele said, I actually can't see this, so maybe we can talk about it later, but just maybe what brought you today and what you're hoping to get out of the session as well. So to start off with, I'm going to look at what trauma is and the various ways in which it can manifest. While I'm focusing on the trauma impacts on women due to the fact that domestic abuse and sexual assault primarily affect these groups, I also just want to recognise that men and boys can also be victims. And the main reason I want to give a good overview of trauma is that indirect trauma, such as vicarious trauma, often presents in very similar ways to trauma itself. The term trauma originates in the medical sciences, where it originally meant physical injury. However, the term is now more commonly used to describe psychological injury. Trauma theory has its roots in psychoanalytic theory, where as early as the 19th century, women's hysteria was seen as resulting from mental trauma and the curse of female reproductive organs. And the solution to this hysteria was usually a hysterectomy. Trauma theory experienced a resurgence of interest after the 2 world wars, where it was applied to the distress experienced by returning soldiers. And the goal of trauma therapy then was to assist soldiers through their symptoms of distress, their memory loss and lack of responsiveness, just in order to return them back to the front line. But alongside this understanding of combat trauma, the women's movement in the 1970s started to recognise the private trauma of women's lives and move this into the public consciousness. And feminists began to politicise rape, childhood sexual abuse, and domestic abuse as social problems that impacted women's mental health. Trauma theory provided the language to describe the significant impacts of men's violence and was used by feminists in a way to locate these problems experienced by individual women within a wider socio-political context. And traumatic events are seen to be experiences that overwhelm the ordinary adaptations to life, and they usually involve threats to life, bodily integrity, or a close personal encounter with violence and death. And common feelings are intense fear, helplessness, and loss of control. However, these individual understandings of trauma have been challenged by Australian First Nations scholars and activists such as Judy Atkinson. In Australian First Nations scholarship and activism, the notions of intergenerational and collective trauma feature prominently in the accounts of historical and ongoing impacts of colonisation, slavery, and genocide. Atkinson views Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander trauma as cumulative or compounding, which differs from trauma that may be caused by a natural disaster or a one-off interpersonal event. Colonisation, she argues, set in motion a series of disasters, one precipitating another, to propagate trauma on trauma on trauma. In this model, trauma is both individual and collective, and it is passed on intergenerationally through survivors to their descendants. The most common diagnosis associated with trauma is post-traumatic stress disorder, which was first included in the 3rd edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, in 1980. The prevalence of PTSD is around twice as high for women as it is for men. And you can see there you've got 10 to 11% of women in the UK, a lifetime prevalence of being diagnosed with PTSD, and 5% of men. The symptoms of PTSD include intrusive nightmares and memories, avoidance and anxiety, and changes in memory, identity, and worldview. And in order to be diagnosed with PTSD, you need to have all of the following for at least 1 month. So you need to have 1, re-experiencing symptoms such as nightmares, memories, and flashbacks, and at least 1 avoidance symptom, such as not wanting to go near the location where an assault took place, or maybe not wanting to go into work where you may have heard about someone's trauma. And you need at least 2 arousal and reactivity symptoms, so like trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating, and at least 2 cognition and mood symptoms. So that would include trouble remembering the event and maybe feeling guilty. And it's really important to note that the most recent DSM has expanded the diagnosis to now broaden the definition of PTSD to include those who have experienced secondary trauma or indirect trauma in their professional roles. So PTSD could actually be diagnosed if you experience any of these symptoms from doing your work. Most of the research on the impacts of working in the domestic abuse and sexual assault space has been with direct service workers, so social workers and advocates. In various studies looking at the impact of this work on practitioners, it has been found to be about 7 out of 10 workers who will report symptoms of secondary trauma. A 2011 study with social workers in domestic abuse showed about 65% reported secondary traumatic stress. Similarly, another study found that 70.2% of social workers reported symptoms of secondary trauma, which included intrusive thoughts and numbing responses. And another study showed around 71% of rape crisis workers report secondary traumatic stress. So now we're going to look at some of the labels of indirect trauma, and there's quite a lot of crossover in these diagnoses and labels. So indirect trauma can manifest in secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. Secondary trauma is defined as behaviours and emotions that result from hearing or knowing about a traumatizing event and the associated stress that may come from helping or wanting to help those who have been traumatized. And some of the signs of secondary trauma are similar to PTSD and include flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, numbing, and dissociation. And compassion fatigue may occur as the result of an ongoing or cumulative exposure to the trauma, suffering, and distress of others. So some symptoms here include the inability to concentrate, decreased self-esteem, apathy, preoccupation with trauma, perfectionism, rigidity, or in extreme cases, thoughts of harming self or others. And compassion fatigue can also present as anxiety, fear, helplessness, and depression, and has been shown to impact someone's worldview and undermine their personal and professional relationships. And burnout relates to how individuals function within their workplace and occurs when their health and outlook on life are negatively impacted due to their work. There's quite a gradual development of burnout, which includes physical and emotional symptoms of exhaustion. People who experience burnout have low job satisfaction, they feel very overwhelmed at work and have feelings of powerlessness. Burnout does not have to relate to working with traumatized people, and it can actually impact anyone in their workplace. And vicarious trauma is defined as being the transformation of the therapist's or helper's inner experience as a result of empathetic engagement with survivors and their trauma. So what differentiates this definition from the others around indirect trauma is that vicarious trauma is seen as an interaction between the individual's personal history and the survivor's traumatic experience, as well as the social and cultural context in which this all occurs in. The term vicarious trauma was first used in the early 1990s by practitioners working with survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And signs of vicarious trauma include feeling infected by trauma, feelings of powerlessness, hopelessness, pessimism, cynicism, and feeling that the world is an unsafe place. Effects of vicarious trauma can be long-term and overwhelming and may lead to absenteeism from work. And there's some particular risk factors that have been found in the development of indirect trauma, particularly in relation to this work. Having a history of sexual assault and domestic violence has been found to increase the risks for developing vicarious trauma. However, this is also shown to greatly enhance therapeutic skills. So those working in direct service work. Being female is also a risk factor. Being younger and having less experience. But what can minimise the risk is regular one-on-one supportive supervision, ongoing training in the impacts of trauma and self-care, workplaces that embed self-care into their policies and practices, peer support, and established self-care practices. There's little recognition from universities on the impact that research in this specific field can have on scholars. So often researchers work alone in their area of specialty with no connection to a community of other researchers. And this isolation can exacerbate the impacts of domestic and sexual abuse research. There are also pressures from institutions to publish research findings, to travel, present your research finding at conferences, to bring in research funding, all based on your research, all of which can further compound the effects and pressures of research in this area. And there's lots of different stages of doing research, particularly if you are a PhD student, that can unexpectedly bring on a whole lot of indirect trauma about the work that you're doing. So conducting interviews, transcribing those interviews, coding the findings, analysing the findings, writing up your project, having to debate your findings, particularly if it's something that's, quite personal to you, presenting at conferences, and even having to do media interviews. They're all examples of different stages where you can be impacted by vicarious trauma. And really importantly to discuss too is the role of a researcher is very different to that of a practitioner. So there's much less opportunity to offer practical assistance to victim survivors. And because of that, there can be a potential for the experience to be more traumatizing than with direct service work in domestic and sexual abuse. And I think we've run this workshop a few times now with students, and what they've sort of said too is just a surprise that they've had, that we've had workers who have a lot of experience working in direct service, but it's been their PhD. It's been that research that has actually really tripped them up. And it's been repeatedly reading case studies or feeling even obligated to read. One woman we're speaking to, she said, I don't want, they've put their voices in there, they've put their words in there. I feel like I owe it to them to read this and to keep reading this work, even though it feels so hard to keep reading that. And I think we can sort of minimize it by thinking, oh, it's just reading. It's not, I'm not actually working with, if you're not really working with victim survivors directly. And so there can be like a sort of minimizing of the real impacts of this, and the fact that the very difference of it to direct service work is what can actually be quite traumatizing, because you can't do anything to help this person. You don't necessarily know what's happened to them after. And so that can really impact you in quite a different way. And there's also a real risk to researchers' well-being when their past or present experiences are similar to that they're researching. And I think we know in this field, a lot of what draws students in and researchers in is history, is knowing very personally what the impacts or how it feels to be a victim survivor of sexual assault or domestic abuse. And so doing that can actually put you at quite a risk as well, even though, obviously we want students to be able to draw on whatever they want to be able to draw on, and we encourage that. It also is, we need to be aware that that can really make you quite vulnerable and at risk to vicarious trauma. So now we're going to look at some theories around how vicarious trauma actually develops, and what sort of pathways in which there's been theories around how vicarious trauma might develop. So it's theorized that one of the ways that we can catch someone else's trauma by speaking with them or reading about their experiences is via empathy. So there's seen to be 3 different types of empathy. There is cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, and compassionate empathy. In cognitive empathy, we recognize what another person is feeling. In emotional empathy, we actually feel what that person is feeling. And in compassionate empathy, we want to help the other person deal with their situation and their emotions. And emotional empathy is said to be the type of empathy that is the main risk factor for developing vicarious trauma. And that is because it's theorized that our brain can actually simulate the same state within our body of that of the person we're suffering. So by putting ourselves into someone else's shoes, we can both observe and imagine how that person might be feeling, which can actually give rise to an emotional state along with associated body responses similar to that person. So one of the theories about the way that this sort of develops is there was a discovery of mirror neurons, which are single cell neurons that activate during both the execution of certain activities and the observation of those actions. So what they've shown is that with brain imagery, that it will show the same part of the brain activates when we feel an emotion to when we actually observe someone else feeling that emotion. And I would, as I said at the start, there's some disclaimer around, I think some of the science around this is pretty thin, but some trauma specialists feel that this part of empathy is really important to understand when you look at vicarious trauma. And so trauma expert Babette Rothschild refers to emotional contagion and somatic empathy as being really important terms related to vicarious trauma. So Rothschild does most of her work looking at vicarious trauma and working with with direct service workers. But in her research, she's found that often when we work with traumatized people, we unconsciously mirror and share their emotions. So emotional contagion is defined as a tendency to take on the sensory, motor, physiological and affective states of others. And it's argued that one of the main mechanisms that underlie this emotional contagion is automatic mimicry. So which is the synchronization of expressions, vocalizations, postures, and movements with those of another person. So when people unconsciously mimic someone else's expressions of emotion, they can actually come to feel reflections of those emotions within themselves. And somatic empathy is vicariously experiencing the state of another unconsciously. So the perception of another person experiencing a specific emotion will elicit a motor act. So you may smile when you observe someone else being happy, and that just happens automatically. You don't necessarily have to think about it. Or you may have a somatic bodily response. So you may flinch when you see someone else getting hurt, and that's just something that automatically happens. So there's a few of the techniques that we'll go through here to minimize vicarious trauma. They may not relate to the nature of your work, as you may not be working directly with victim survivors. However, there's a lot of suggestions here that you may be able to take and apply to your work to minimize the risks of vicarious trauma. So one of these is actually drawing on a lot of that work on that Rothschild is talking about mimicking the way in which other people, their posture and maybe their facial expressions as well. So when you're working with victim survivors, it's important to be aware of your posture and how you might be mirroring those that you are talking to. In a research interview, for example, try to be aware of how you might be mimicking the expressions of your participant. And you might only become aware of this because you start to feel yourself having a physical stress reaction. So you might be feeling something like hyperarousal, which can happen as a response to fear. And this might be feeling your heart beating faster, your legs tensing, your breathing getting shallow. And I'll just give a personal example of this. When I was conducting interviews with women with cognitive disabilities about their experiences of violence, and it was in rural Victoria in Australia. And so it was set up that day that we had to do a lot of these interviews one after the other because we couldn't stay in the rural town for much longer than that day. And during those interviews, which were, very difficult to hear, and obviously much more difficult for the women to tell us about it, I could feel my legs getting so sore, and I was thinking, oh, I wonder why my legs are getting so sore. Like I just wanted to run. Like I just had that feeling, like I really just wanted to run. And I had a little bit of experience then with understanding vicarious trauma, or at least understanding trauma. So I could sort of think like, I think I actually was very much leaning in, mimicking what the women were doing. And mainly I was doing that as a way to make them, I realized I was doing it to make them feel comfortable too. So I think sometimes you can take up the mannerisms of someone because it's an attempt to, at least in it was an attempt to make them feel comfortable. But at that, what I was actually unconsciously doing was really taking that trauma in, and for days after, my legs were just aching so much, and I felt like I was hyperventilating and stuff as well. And now I know when I'm conducting research, I definitely wouldn't do it bang, bang, bang after the other. Like that was very, very difficult because they were very difficult interviews and complex interviews, but also understanding a little bit more about what my body needs and what I have to do after an interview. So as Michele said, I've been interviewing women whose partners are CSAM offenders, so child sexual abuse material offenders, but they're also been abusing the women as well. And so around those interviews, it was really important for me to get up afterwards, and I'll talk a little bit more about this sort of thing as well. And really the way in which this manifests for me is in my body, so feeling really tense in my legs. So just even walking around the room, playing with my daughter and sort of, running a little bit, and actually consciously thinking I am doing this too because my legs are hurting because I had that interview, and I need to get that out of my body, and I need to help that move through because that didn't happen to me, what she was talking about. That didn't happen to me, and I'm safe, I'm in this house, I'm okay. And and really letting that pass through me and acknowledging that that was passing through me as well. So yeah, those kinds of things are really, really important to notice. And if you can, to try to catch yourself in the time, as it's actually happening. So one of the best things to do is actually change your posture. So if you notice the fact that you are leaning forward, that you are mimicking what the victim survivor is doing with their body, you need to sit up straighter. It's really important to ground yourself. So if you're able to use your legs to really push into the ground, that sort of grounding with your feet is really important because it actually is the furthest part away from your body. So putting your feet into the ground is really is shown to be very important in terms of bringing yourself back into the body. Taking a sip of water, just something really simple like that, particularly if it might be cold or warm water, and even noticing that sensation of the cold water in your mouth, or the hot or the warmth, and again, bringing yourself into your body in that way. Engaging your senses, so scanning around the room, and sometimes I will have something in my view before I start the interview, so I know that I can look over there and that will bring me back into the room. So for me, it's having something yellow because my daughter's hair, she has yellow hair, and that helps sort of ground me a little bit. So I look at that yellow, it's even just a flick around to sort of see that again, bringing me back into my body, bringing myself into that present moment so that I'm not going, my body isn't leading me into having that sort of hyper arousal state. So anything that you can feel, hear, smell, touch, taste, see, anything that you can do in that moment, and being a bit prepared before the interviews as well to know that you've got those things that you can sort of flick on. Some people have, a picture of someone that they love, and I'll also get onto this next thing, that people wear specific clothing or items. So some trauma therapists will wear certain clothing that makes them feel quite protected and strong. So they'll have a certain jacket on that will feel really protective, and then they will consciously remove that when they come home. They also might wear certain colours. So there might be a certain colour that they associate with feeling strong, or with feeling protected, or with feeling soothed. So anything like that that you can consciously do to bring into your work can be really important, particularly something, you know, that symbolizes something for you. So maybe even if you've got some trauma therapists will have a ring, or you know, some jewelry or something like that that they can sort of fiddle with even while they're doing their work. Anything like that that can sort of symbolize to you that of staying calm and soothed and protected. Those things are really important. And one thing that has been shown to be very important when doing this work is to control your empathetic imagery. So as I said earlier, you know, often we put ourselves into someone's shoes, and we can't, you know, at least for me, this happens really unconsciously. So it's the way in which I might just think about someone, or even help my empathy or my compassion sort of turn on for them, is to sort of think, oh gosh, what if that happened to me or my family? But that's actually quite a, that would maximize your risk of vicarious trauma, unfortunately. So one of the really important things to do is control that imagery. So we picture what's happened to that person, imagine how we'd react, and see ourselves as that person. But it's been really helpful to try to, it's been shown to be very helpful to try to change something about that imagery. So if you feel yourself picturing what it would feel like to be this person, you can try to change this image in some way. So you can make it black and white, you can blur it, or picture it at a distance on a TV screen. And I know, like, I've been trying to practice this since I read it, and I've spoken to therapist friends who work in the trauma field, and they all agree that that's really helpful, but it's hard to catch themselves doing that. So they you know, often you're already on the train of sort of, oh my God, this is awful, and thinking about what it would be like to be that person, and what would I do, and you're already sort of caught up in that. So one of the key things actually is that sort of mindfulness as well. But for me, when I can start to think about it, the blurring it and seeing it in black and white is actually been really good. It almost stops it before it gets too far. If I'm sort of thinking, you know, that's awful, and you know, what happened to their child, or whatever happened, you know, but yeah, just trying to see it in black and white has been really good at sort of stopping it at that moment, and then allowing me to obviously still have a lot of compassion for that person, but realize that it didn't happen to me. So me feeling really anxious and upset and worried about it doesn't necessarily change what happened for them. It can just make it actually harder for me to do the work. So I still have a lot of compassion for them, but I'm not having to put myself in their shoes in order to feel that. And it's also really important to have a post-work ritual after engaging in traumatic material. So you want to create a boundary between your work and your personal world. And this can be, as I said previously, changing your clothing. It can also be other things such as turning off your computer. So when I was doing interviews with workers here in the UK that work with victim survivors of child sexual abuse, but also their mothers. And one of them was saying, you know, she has a computer that is completely separate. So the work that she does, she also works with perpetrators as well. So that work that she does is on a completely different computer. She doesn't let her child touch that computer. She's really, that sort of separation, she'll put it away, and that's the computer that she does all that sort of stuff on. And she keeps it completely separate from her work. And that's how she sort of coped with having those boundaries, particularly since COVID and having to do a lot of this work at home. And that's also been work when I was speaking to social workers in Australia who work in domestic violence, and they were saying, you know, I'm in my room doing this now, and I can't, there's no separation anymore. You know, and feeling so much vicarious trauma because of the fact they couldn't create that boundary. So they felt like it was bleeding into all of their work. And I think when we're doing research in this area and when we're students, we kind of do, you keep working late into the night, and there's sometimes a real blurred boundary between this work and your life. And I think it's really important to create some rituals that actually create that boundary. So turning off the computer, other workers that I spoke to said they had a candle going. So while they're working, they'll have a candle going, which smells nice, and also, allows them to have that focus when they're doing their work. So they've got something nice there that they can sort of bring themselves back into the room. And then at the end of the day, they blow that candle out. And that to them creates that real separation between the work and now their day. And other workers will say they like going for a walk, so that can sort of get a lot of that sort of tension out of their bodies, and create a separation between their work. Even just having a shower, and we'll talk about this next, but and some mindfulness exercises can really help as well. So an essential aspect of minimizing vicarious trauma is self-care. And self-care for trauma professionals has been defined as the proactive strategies or routines that professionals use to offset the negative aspects of working with trauma victims and promote their own well-being. And self-care strategies are characterized as attending to the physical, the psychological, the emotional, and the spiritual, and they should take place on an individual and organizational level. So it's also really important. So when we say self-care, we sort of think, that's sort of fluffy, taking care of ourselves. And this is not pampering, and it's not a luxury. It's a requisite of doing this work. It is an ethical imperative of doing this work. It should be an essential part of our professional identities. There's limited evidence of exactly what self-care strategies are most effective for those working in this violence against women space. But in general, mindfulness-based stress reduction, so such as sitting meditation, body scanning, yoga, and loving kindness meditation have been successful in reducing worker stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, and these have been shown to actually have lasting effects over time. Engaging in things like reflective writing, reading, listening to music, guided imagery and breath work been shown to be effective in self-care. I'm not sure if that's going to show up. There you go. So the organisation that I work with in Australia developed a series of yoga videos with a trauma-informed yoga teacher, and these have been designed especially for researchers and advocates. These are short videos that can be adapted for people with differing levels of mobility. And I'll leave the link, I think maybe on these slides, you'll be able to see the link to those videos. So they're really short, they're about like 10 minutes, I think, and some are a bit shorter. And so workers will sometimes do that either through their day or as part of that process and boundary into the next, so between work and finishing work. So yeah, I'll leave that so you can try out some of those more practical things. A trauma-informed and sensitive workplace and organisational structure is actually seen as critical to reduce or prevent the effects of working with trauma. So I know I've been talking a lot about sort of what you can personally do, but a lot of this, as you can see, is actually beyond your control. So core to preventing the negative effects of working with trauma is embedding a culture of self-care into the organisation that you work for, with the prioritising of things like holidays, flexible hours for workers, and including continuing education on self-care. So research suggests that organisations should ensure that this prioritising of self-care is included in mission statements and organisational policies. Regular opportunities for debriefing and the provision of supervision is considered best practice. And these organisational strategies have the effect of normalising the impacts of indirect trauma. Therefore, they can reduce the stigma and shame that individual workers may feel. And while throughout this I have used such terminology as vicarious trauma, I do want to highlight that these concepts can individualise the impacts of this work. By locating the impacts within individuals, there's a sense that what is wrong is within us and that the burden of fixing this wrong is our responsibility. However, the issues that we're exposed to in this work are societal issues. They're issues of oppression and social injustice. And the fact that they impact us is not due to our faulty coping skills or lack of self-care. And Reynolds highlights that it's often not the victims that we work with and their traumatic experiences that burn us out. It's the context in which we work that creates the conditions that facilitate the development of vicarious trauma, particularly when we feel that our ethics and our deep commitment to social justice are not shared and supported by our workplace and colleagues. And I think that it's a really important point and something that I hear a lot working with direct service workers is that it's not the survivor stories that is hard. Well, that's very hard. It's the fact that every step that they try to take and everything that they try to do for this survivor, there is structural disadvantages there. There's things that they just can't change, and that those are the things that really burn them out. And other research that I'm doing is actually looking at organised crime involvement in so perpetrators who are involved in organised crime. And I was speaking with a colleague who works in a different area now, but she was working in direct service work. And she was saying, I said, oh, do you want to be interviewed for the project and stuff? Because we're looking at speaking to workers. And I hadn't realised it at the time, but she said, I don't want to speak about that work because that is why I left working in the refuge that she was working in. And I didn't know that that's what happened to her. I thought she just sort of moved on to something else, but she just could barely even talk about it anymore because of the fact, and this is quite specific, but the fact that working with women who's where the perpetrator is in Australia, I don't know, sorry what they're called here, but bikie gangs in Australia, she came up against every single barrier that you could think of because she just couldn't help this particular woman. And it wasn't the woman's story and it wasn't what she went through. And as absolutely horrific as that was, it was the fact that she just couldn't help her. She couldn't go to the police. This perpetrator could find her no matter where she was. They had bikies have contacts in social services in Australia. So anytime she went to change her address or tried to get financial support, he could find her, or there was someone that found her. Anytime she changed her address, they've got someone that works in the place where you get your licenses. So when you change your driver's license, so he would find her that way. And there was family and all sorts of people looking out. She became quite a difficult client or what's seen as difficult client because she had been forced to take a number of drugs as part of being in the gang. So she was, that services didn't want her. Anyway, the thing here was not her, it was the systems. And I think that we need to remember that as well, that often it is that this is beyond your control sometimes, and it is actually things that we come up against within systems, and we will read that in our research work, and we'll see it where we just think that just it isn't fair what's happened, and there's nothing we can do about it. And it's often at that point is where we will start to feel that real trauma come up, and that vicarious trauma, and that, as we talked about, that worldview where everything, the world's just a horrible place and this is just never going to change, and that real hopelessness. But as I have discussed today, so there's potential risks of working in the field of domestic abuse and sexual assault. However, there is a growing body of research that's pointed to the many rewards and benefits that professionals gain from trauma work. And these can include increased sensitivity, compassion, insight, tolerance, empathy, joy, hope, and becoming richer, deeper, and better people. The relational benefits of trauma work have been identified, including paying closer attention to intimate relationships, spending more quality and meaningful time with loved ones. And some of these benefits have been identified in concepts such as compassion satisfaction, vicarious post-traumatic growth, and vicarious resilience. But the development of these vicarious benefits are often dependent on the work environment. So feeling supported, having supervision, peer support and training are really essential in developing these vicarious benefits. So I've actually come to the end of the workshop now. So trauma can play a central, although sometimes hidden, role in the work that we do in domestic abuse and sexual assault. It's really important for us to have an awareness of what trauma is and how it might manifest in our work. And feeling empathy is a normal human reaction to researching and working with victim survivors. But what we can do when we understand how trauma can manifest and how vicarious trauma can manifest, we can minimize those impacts. And again, I just wanted to reiterate that it's not solely your responsibility to cope with the impacts of this work. And your university and workplace should provide support to help minimize the impacts of vicarious trauma. So now I'm happy to take some questions. I'll flick, there's just some references there if anyone's interested in that kind of stuff. So I'll stop sharing my screen.